Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
Welcome to the latest installment of our Constitutional Conversations series at the James Madison Foundation here, a series that goes back well over 10 years now, and we've been privileged to have a number of the finest historians, political scientists of the American regime, and we're rejoined, I should say, by Dr. Paul Carrese. Let me say it's a personal pleasure to be reunited with my former colleague from the Air Force Academy many years ago. So Dr. Paul O. Carrese is the founding director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, where he has now become a professor within the school that he founded. For 2 decades prior, he was a civilian professor at the Air Force Academy, where he co-founded and directed the Academy's Great Books Honors Program. He's been a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, postdoctoral fellow at Harvard, a Fulbright fellow at Delhi University in India, and a Forbes visiting fellow in the James Madison Program at Princeton. Dr. Carrese has published many articles and book chapters on Enlightenment political philosophy, American constitutionalism, and political thought, grand strategy, and civic education is his latest bailiwick. For example, he co-edited John Marshall's The Life of George Washington, published by Liberty Fund in 2001, and co-edited a collection of essays entitled American Grand Strategy, War, Justice, and Peace in American Political Thought, as well as 2 books on the celebrated Montesquieu with the University of Chicago and Cambridge University Presses. Dr. Carrese, welcome.
Great to be with you. Great to be back with the James Madison Foundation.
And we're delighted to have you. We're going to talk about Washington's farewell address. And for the audience, I just had the pleasure of hearing 2 hours worth of lecture from Dr. Carrese on that subject. So it's fresh in both of our minds. But let's talk initially about the reputation of Washington's farewell address, if we may. For well over a century, maybe a century and a half, the farewell address of 1796 was studied in schools. It was read at public gatherings. I suppose the U.S. Senate still reads portions of the address now in a kind of perfunctory way, but it was respected as one of the greatest American artifacts, one of the greatest documents of our history, encapsulating our political philosophy as a regime, but no longer. Why is that?
It's important as a question to think about how much the idea of citizenship education has changed in the past century. As we were just discussing, Jefferson and Madison agreed when setting the curriculum for the University of Virginia in the 1820s that the farewell address, Washington's address, should be on the required reading list for every University of Virginia student, along with the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers. So it was that significant, the address.
And the Virginia Resolutions, 1799.
That's the Alien and Sedition Acts. That's fair point.
Yes.
And yes, a century ago, the Senate did start the tradition of reading the farewell address once a year. That was largely with a focus on the foreign policy section of the address. Henry Cabot Lodge wanted farewell address read. But it has declined markedly. I think it's not a good thing. I think, in fact, we could look around at the state of America's civic culture and our political culture and ask the question, where have we gone wrong in our approach to citizenship education and civic education? And one would be not having recourse to resources like Washington's farewell address. I suppose it's the case that Lincoln still has, generally speaking, a better standing in K-12 public schooling and in American civic culture, and that's a good thing. But we would be forgetting that Washington was an extraordinarily important influence on Lincoln. A scholar like Diana Schaub has recently looked at Lincoln's arguably 3 greatest addresses and noted that the first of them maybe your viewers would know this. It's called the Lyceum Address, 1838. Lincoln's warning about mob violence, a culture of angry, violent political disagreement arising in the 1830s. And the title of the address is The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions. But Diana's point is that there are direct echoes from Washington's farewell address to Lincoln in 1838, that Lincoln must have read it recently. So this is a general pattern, I think, for Lincoln's statesmanship, that he looks back to the founders, especially to Washington, to think about how to rescue the Constitutional Republic. So if we're not directly reading Washington ourselves, because we think, well, he's a white Virginia patriarchal slaveholding figure from long, long ago, he's not relevant to us, I think we damage ourselves and we damage civic education. So the farewell address is an extraordinary resource that we could use right now about constitutionalism, citizenship, the danger of parties and demagoguery, among other topics.
And you've made the point that so many American citizens now don't even consider themselves to be citizens. And the line is being blurred between citizen and non-citizen. So let's turn, shall we, just to the very first words of the farewell address, and it's a theme that you might want to enlarge on, and that is friendship. How does he begin that address? Friends and fellow citizens. And he uses that word, the 18th century word, amity, which just means friendship, repeatedly, there and elsewhere. So could you talk a little bit about Washington's understanding of citizenship, and particularly American citizenship and nationalism, as it finds its way interlarded in the farewell address?
Yes. So the farewell address is the summation of Washington's political life and career. And he does get the help of Hamilton directly in 1796. And then he directs Hamilton to use a first draft, so to speak, from 1792 that Madison had written. Washington had wanted to retire from public life and the presidency after one term. So the 1792 Madison address, and then the fresh one that Hamilton and Washington are working out in 1796. And Washington thinks of this as a summation of his career and his principles. And so it's no accident that phrases and principles that he had started to use in the 1780s are in the 1796 address. And one of them is this idea of the need for civic friendship. Certainly the word friendship and amity, we would call it today civic friendship. It's an idea captured in Madison's famous paper, Federalist No. 10, that free peoples are going to disagree about everything. Large, fundamental questions, smaller questions. And so a civic culture needs to have a foundation in a shared set of principles and a shared spirit of agreement that holds together the whole political order through the continual, perpetual disagreements. So Washington mentions this in his first farewell address, it's often called his 1783 circular letter to the state governors, as the general who has won the Revolutionary War and sort of signing off all during 1783 and preparing for retirement. He uses it, the word amity that you just used, he uses that in the transmittal letter of the Constitutional Convention, Philadelphia, 1787, transmitting the Constitution to the Articles of Confederation Congress, saying this is what we've produced, now it has to be debated, ratified. He talks about the Constitution itself in the convention coming from 4 months of deliberation, but a spirit of amity and mutual concession and compromise. So yes, then it's no accident that he invokes this idea of friendship and citizenship as the opening salutation of this extraordinary address. And again, it's worth remembering that he was an extraordinarily powerful figure, the single most famous man on the continent, putting aside Ben Franklin, right? All regard for Ben Franklin. Extraordinarily powerful and could have, as many figures have throughout human history, could have abused his authority and his position. He's the conquering hero general, right? He could have immediately turned away from some idea of what we would call democratic Republican government. But from the 1780s, at the end of the war, he supports constitutional government on the basis of the principles of the Declaration, consent to the governed. And here he is in 1796, retiring for a second time from public life and graciously saying, we are fellow citizens, as powerful as I am. We are fellow citizens and we are civic friends of this constitutional order. And then there are phrases throughout the address which reinforce this spirit and this principle.
Yes, I'm thinking of that. He refers to himself as an old and affectionate friend a little bit later. So you touched on a couple of things that I'd like you to expand on a little bit. And the first, you referred to Madison and Federalist 10. You referred to his desire, Washington's, to retire after his first term. In fact, if I remember correctly, he wanted out after just 2 years into his first term. He nearly died the first year he was in office of a cancerous tumor. He'd had enough after just 2 years, and so he asks Madison to draft him a farewell address. So we have Madison's influence. We have Hamilton's, as you say. Washington gives him a précis, more or less, and says, would you expand on these? But there's a third person who comes in just at the end, and I believe it's John Jay, isn't it?
Yes.
So my question is, well, two questions. The first is, what's the relationship between that first farewell address, the circular letter of 1783, and the farewell address? And secondly, is it fair, as some people have done, to refer to Washington's 1796 farewell address because of the influence of Hamilton and Madison and Jay? Is it really Federalist Paper number 86?
Marvelous point. Marvelous point. And to set the context of 1796, a ferocious partisanship has broken out in Washington's second term from 1793 onward. And if we think our politics now is angry and polarized and irrational accusations being traded about, this is very much happening in the 1790s. So it's a very deliberate act on Washington's part, having decided that he should not die in office, that that's an important principle, that he should retire from public life and show that the political life of a self-governing democratic republic is about citizenship in a constitutional order, and every public servant is a public servant, right? Having made that principle, then to very deliberately involve Madison from the 1792 draft with Hamilton and then finally Jay. And that means pulling together peoples and voices who had separated during the 1790s into partisan factions. Madison is one of the founders of the Democratic Republican Party with Jefferson. Hamilton clearly is a leading Federalist. These people are not on speaking terms with each other by 1796. And here is Washington pulling them back together. Now, it's not publicly known at the time that he's done that, but it informs our understanding of what he tried to do. And the point about John Jay is really terrific, that Washington, very fine scholars have shown this, as you just noted, Washington is deeply engaged in the drafting. We might say hectoring poor Alexander Hamilton back and forth about the drafts, and then gets to a near final draft, Washington, that he likes, then says to Hamilton, would you show this to John Jay?
And can you remind us, what is Jay's part in that political fractiousness of the 1790s?
Jay is an extraordinary, underappreciated figure, basically the foreign secretary under the Articles of Confederation, a very distinguished lawyer, statesman in domestic and international affairs. Washington selects him as president to be the first Chief Justice of the United States. He has since resigned from the court to become governor of New York. But while Chief Justice, Washington asks him to undertake an extraordinary diplomatic mission to Britain to negotiate a follow-on treaty with the British, because there was all kinds of contention about the terms of the 1783 Treaty of Paris, and where it was each side complying with it, and things had gotten slightly complicated because of the French Revolution in 1789. So Jay undertakes agrees with Washington to do this, undertakes this extraordinary diplomatic service. And we have to remember, the fax lines in the internet is often down in the, so it's an extraordinary responsibility for Jay to take on a diplomatic mission across the Atlantic Ocean, for Washington to trust him. Here are the general guidelines for a new treaty with Britain, but Jay's got to execute judgment on the spot. So that treaty, which we now call the Jay Treaty, is so controversial that Jay is, being burned in effigy in the United States in the partisan conflict over Washington's foreign policy and the Jay Treaty. So for Washington to say in 1796, imagine Alexander Hamilton, Broadway star, being demeaned by Washington to say, this is really good work, Alex, but would you show it to John Jay? And so Jay and Hamilton spend a day together in New York, going over what is the near final draft. And so it's an extraordinary effort by Washington to make sure this is a comprehensive, balanced, considered statement of his political principles and his parting advice as a friend to America.
It's a marvelous point you've made, and it's just really occurring to me now how friendly an endeavor that was, because we have the maelstrom of controversy created by Jay and the Jay Treaty. I think Jay says at one point, I could have walked, I'll get this wrong, but I could have walked from Georgia to Massachusetts by night and be lit the whole way by my effigies being burned. Something to that effect.
Yeah.
So we have the controversy created by Jay, and then Washington's magnanimity in bringing him in. And of course, by this time, 1796, isn't it fair to say that Madison has broken with his old compatriot Hamilton? And it might not be an overstatement to say that by this time, Madison believes that Hamilton has betrayed the Constitution that they co-labored to bring forth. So again, it's an inclusive gesture on Washington's part. It's a gesture of amity. It's magnanimous to do.
Yes. And I think in the background, Washington was aware that everything he did would be pored over by the public, by historians. He writes this when he takes up the presidency in 1789, that everything he does will be an example and be setting a precedent. So I think he must have known that eventually the story would come out of how he had very carefully pulled together the factions and tried to say that the best of the American founding was this spirit of accommodation and reasonable compromise and consensus, and to remember in the midst of the perpetual partisan disputes of a free republic, we share more, we have more in common, we have deeper common ground than we are dominated by the disagreements. And the disagreements are important, but we forget this. And back to your first point, the fact that we don't teach the farewell address, that we don't admire it. Why was it admired for 2 centuries? Because of this, because of the extraordinary magnanimity and the crucial civic lesson that we must return to common ground. We must understand our common ground and then disagree.
And he says that the name of American should be the source of greatest pride to you. It should not be Virginian or New Jerseyite or whatever.
Yes.
It's again, that unifying impulse. Yes. So unity is a great principle for Washington. He uses the word principle consciously, I think.
Yes.
So if we could turn now to some of the, Washington was fond of architectural metaphors, so let's use that. What are some of those props, those pillars, those supports of American unity that he lays out in the farewell address of 96?
Yes, he does say that he might be excused for offering parting counsel because he has served his country, he says, for 45 years. That takes it back to what we call the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. And the first is that liberty free, self-governing people should be maintained as a principle, but he says Americans are so committed to that, he'll move quickly to the second one, which is the Constitution and the Union. That the Union is crucial for each of the member republics, member states. They must continually recall that as much as there are frictions among the states, as much as there might be concern about the national or central, what we call federal government, taking too much authority, this is the enlightened self-interest of each of the states to be part of this union. They have more security, more prosperity than they would have if they were alone or in smaller clumps, let's say smaller confederations. So the union is crucial, and it's the Constitution which holds the union together and keeps the federal republic moving and moving forward. And then long advice about union and constitution. Then the greatest danger to threat against union and constitution is the spirit of faction or the spirit of party. So he spends quite a bit of time on that in the address, and those phrases should be those should be widely read. They should be on T-shirts right now, some of those phrases. The warning that, again, free people are going to disagree, free people are going to form into factions, into parties. But be aware of the suicidal tendency that can arise of being so involved in your own factional views that you don't see you're destroying the republic, the constitutional order, the common principles that you need as a free citizen of this republic. So he doesn't advocate any attempt to exterminate parties or factions. They're going to exist. He's following Madison in Federalist No. 10 on this point. But we have to be very wary, each of us as individuals, of this tendency to narrow our thinking, to undermine our own principles and thinking by being part of a faction or a school or a party. And then it gets back to this principle of civic friendship you just mentioned. The common principles are more important than party. That requires civic education, so he goes on to some other principles. Sound finance and credit, beware of national debt. Who would think that matters? Partisanship, why does that matter? National debt, why does that matter? And then to moral principles. Religion, very generally stated in a non-threatening way to those who have a diversity of religious views out in the country or those who have no religious views at all. Religion as an important source of the civic and moral character of a free people. And then immediately to education. Invest in and support institutions of education, because to the extent that a popular opinion, consent of the governed, is a foundation of this republic, that popular opinion and consent of the governed must be enlightened, must be educated. And then the final set of advice is on foreign policy and strategy.
Yes, which is much studied and still studied, I think, today. But let's return just for a moment to the question of party. And he does give some very stern warnings there against parties. He says, particularly forming them on geographical bases. So, first question, does he equate, do you think, faction and party? Factions being bad by definition, at least in the Federalist Papers. Did he seem to take a very dim view of parties, hence the warning against them, hence using the term faction and party almost interchangeably? What do you think about that?
I do think that's a fair interpretation, a dim view of parties, and yet an awareness that there's nothing a government could do legally against parties without being tyrannical, so to speak. So parties are likely to exist, and yet we must educate ourselves, discipline ourselves to realize the limits and the dangers of parties. So it's one of the many points of balance. I spoke in the lecture earlier about this background principle of moderation in Washington's thought, that more than what, given the state of human affairs across known civilization, and given what we know about free republics and democracies, politics is complicated, and in part, there's more than one important principle that should guide us in putting together a free democratic republic and in sustaining and perpetuating it. Liberty is important. But equality is important, and order and the rule of law is important, just to take those three. So this complicated, nuanced argument about parties and factions is one example of that. Can't ever do away with them, but beware of how self-destructive these tendencies can be. And we are living through an era in which we mostly have forgotten that lesson and that set of principles. And again, the remedy, what to do about it, civic education, citizenship education.
And we might do well to remember that in 1796, as you pointed out a moment ago, James Madison is working closely with Thomas Jefferson to create the first national political party, an opposition party to unseat, perhaps the next Federalist president. And again, I think that goes to the magnanimity of Washington and folding Madison into this, probably knowing full well that there's been a falling out between Madison and Hamilton. Madison is moving into the Democratic Republican fold.
Yes, I think we should give credit to Washington in the immediate, aftermath of his retirement, that there is a peaceful election, so to speak, in 1796, a peaceful transition, then a very contentious election in 1800 for the presidency, and yet ultimately a peaceful resolution and a peaceful transfer of power.
You're saying we have Washington to thank.
I think we have Washington to thank for that. And one nice moment to note in all of that is Richard Brookhiser, a wonderful biography published in 1996 called Founding Father. He likes this little episode. In the first transition, president to president, Adams wins in the Electoral College. Jefferson is the second place winner in the Electoral College, and so Jefferson's the vice president. When there's the inaugural ceremony in 1797, at the end of the ceremony, Washington insists that Adams and Jefferson walk first to leave the stage, so to speak. And Jefferson has difficulty with this. This is the great Washington, and Washington insists. You are the president, Adams. You are the vice president. I'm just, none of all of this nonverbal. I'm just citizen Washington, right? So that idea, knowing that Adams and Jefferson are not on the best of terms politically, but trying to set this larger civic principle and civic culture that we have much more in common as American and much more in common as constitutional citizens. And so I think the fact that with the storms coming ahead through the election of 1800, that we make it through is partly a consequence of kind of the civic capital and civic lessons that Washington had built up.
And he just barely doesn't make it to that election of 1800. He dies in December of 1799. Ironic. Would you say more about religion and especially its tie to civic education? You made a glancing reference to a paragraph that follows the two on religion. Would you talk more about that, especially given your interest and your activity in civic education today?
Yes. Religion in civic life is an important theme of Washington's writings from the Revolutionary War period onward, and it's consistent. His first farewell address, as we've been calling it, the 1783 circular to the state governors, as he's sort of saying goodbye as commander-in-chief, invokes, as all of his major addresses do, invokes providence and gratitude for divine providence, protecting the United States, supporting the United States in this world historical event of defeating what we would call a superpower, establishing an independent republic, but then relying upon or recommending that we rely upon the guidance and the protection of divine providence in the trials ahead. Will we be successful from 1783 onward as a new independent republic in the world, and what are our forms of governing ourselves? So he invokes divine providence, but actually prays. He offers prayers in that 1783 circular address to the governors, which he asks each governor to pass on to each state legislature. He'd use this kind of circular letter throughout the war to communicate with the governors and the legislatures. So prayer as legitimate for a public figure in this new constitutional order under the principles of the Declaration, which itself has 4 references to a divinity. This was a kind of common sense for Washington. On the other hand, he was fully aware that religion was a contentious political principle, that it had divided European political culture, Protestant to Catholic, and different Protestant sects and communities. So, on the other hand, he was very careful in the language he used. He only really once, that I can think of in his public writings, invokes the Jesus Christ figure directly as a source of guidance. And it's in that farewell, that 1783 farewell address, that we should model ourselves on the humility of and charity of this founder of our religion. Otherwise, it's very general, it's called Enlightenment language. This is why some people think he's not really a believing Christian, he's kind of a deist maybe. But I follow that set of scholars who thinks he really is a believing Christian, an observant Anglican, Episcopalian Christian, but in his political leadership role is careful to use more general language about the divinity and divine providence, so as to be non-partisan, so to speak, non-sectarian in invoking the importance of religious belief for free people and for the moral principles needed for free people, so that whatever your own particular religious views, and even if you don't have them, if you are a deist and beyond to an atheist or an agnostic, you could still accept his general principle and the general recommendation he's making that whatever your religious views and whatever religious community you're involved with or you're not involved with, this is an important shared civic principle that we should have and we should support. Not the government doing it directly. He's an advocate of the clause at the end of the Constitution in Article 6 that we mostly forget, that for federal offices there should be no religious test for office. And then he's an advocate of what becomes the Bill of Rights and what becomes the First Amendment with its principles of religious liberty, non-establishment. He's an advocate.
Has been in effect for 5 years by the time this address is
He's an advocate of all of that, and yet, in his mind, this principle of moderation, you could fit seemingly opposing principles in a balance with each other, and yet, he thinks, as great philosophers before and after, just to take Tocqueville in Democracy in America, as they think, the transcendent metaphysical principles and the mores and manners and moral beliefs that comes with religious belief are crucially important for free self-governing principles. This is why there are 4 references to a divinity in the Declaration, for example, right? So Washington thinks all of this can be fit together.
How so? He devotes 2, I would say 3 actually, 3 paragraphs to religion and morality, and then as sort of foundational for healthy democratic society and government. In specific terms, what does he say the benefit of religion is to a democratic society, and particularly American society?
So there's very careful language about the utility of religious belief for a free, self-governing people, and yet it's balanced with genuine regard for the truth and the dignity and the elevation for human beings that religious belief provides. So this set of moral principles that comes from religion is an indispensable prop and support. But it also dignifies and elevates human life individually and as a community, leading to happiness. So here we have these phrases coming, as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, phrases coming out of the Declaration of Independence to be invoking honor and sacred honor, and to be invoking happiness. These higher aims of politics, right? I mean, we often forget this as free, self-governing, democratic, Republican people. We forget that a free politics is supposed to give us the freedom to pursue happiness beyond politics, right? And that politics, the gladiatorial combat of politics is not the end in itself. It is an important end and aim to be self-governing. But happiness is about politics and more than politics. So reminding toward the end of the farewell address that we both need, on the one hand, and are enriched by larger spiritual, religious, moral principles is very consistent with arguments and phrasing he'd been using for 2 decades.
And he uses that language here. He switches from an architectural to a kind of mechanical image. One might even say from a watch. He says, virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. And I think they're the kind of like the mainspring in a watch or a clock. So it's necessary, he says. And then in a paragraph that follows that, which he himself wrote, this is not Hamilton's, this is not Madison's. He then says, promote then, as an object of primary importance, institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. So would you like to talk a little bit about civic education and what this may tell us about Washington's mind with respect to that? Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier about the pet project of his to have a national university, which frustrated him, that did not come about. Tell us about that a little bit, please.
This is a particular project of Washington's as he becomes president, to emphasize citizenship, education, civic education. So from his first annual message, that was the name given for what we now call State of the Union addresses, his first annual message as president, to his last, his 8th annual message, he advocates a national university. He advocates a national military academy, we would call it, as well. And that eventually succeeds. Not in his own 2 terms, not in Adams' 1 term as president afterward. It's in Jefferson's presidency. Finally, there's enough consensus to say, okay, such a power for a national educational institution for the military profession. That's not explicitly in the Constitution, but we can see that it's a legitimate, necessary, and proper power of the federal government because of a national security rationale. But there isn't the same kind of argument you can make about a national university. Benjamin Rush is the famous figure who advocated from 1787, advocated for a national university for a new republic. Wonderful thing that we have private colleges. They tend to be focused on their own states and their own regions and their own religious communities. But for a new federal constitutional republic, Rush argues in 1787, we need a new national educational institution, especially to train the future statesmen, it would have been said then, leaders of this federal republic. Washington immediately agrees with this argument, advocates it. It is frustrating to him that it can't quite get through to the Congress. National consensus can't form around it. So he begins to take private action. He had been given shares by the state of Virginia in a canal company, the Potomac Canal Company, and the gift that he gives in his last will and testament of these shares should be given to a national university is worth millions and millions of dollars that he was willing to pledge. If it ever were to happen, he would want to give his private financial philanthropy in support of it. He does give an important gift to a Virginia educational institution. I think it's called the Liberty Hall Academy, which was in some financial trouble. And he really saves it, his gift. That was, I think, one of the largest, if not the largest, philanthropic educational gift in the history of the United States to that point from a single donor. And in gratitude, the trustees rename it the Washington Academy. And it prospers and goes on, but then falls into difficulty in the 19th century. And after the Civil War, a man named Lee becomes the president of it. And he saves it. And in gratitude, that set of trustees renames it Washington and Lee. And we now know it as Washington Lee University. So there's a direct, you can look at it today, a direct benefit of Washington's commitment to citizenship education. And the larger principle, it should remind us that there it is. Of all the topics you have to leave behind in something like the farewell address, your summation statement of your political principles. All the topics left on the cutting room floor, so to speak, he's not going to let that one go. And as you wrote, he said, it's in his own words, his own phrasing. It's such a commitment on his part that free government requires the investment of citizenship education. This does not operate of itself. It does not perpetuate itself. It's very, very hard. And so you need the education.
Well, you've given us a marvelous tour of the sort of intellectual topography of the farewell address. A final question for you. How do you rate Washington as a political thinker? And I'm laying stress on the word thinker. Year in and year out, Washington places among the top 3 presidents in polls among historians, lay folks. It's always in some order, Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. That's for his executive vigor and his unprecedented presidencies. How do you rate him as a thinker, political thinker?
I mentioned Abraham Lincoln earlier. If scholars today are marveling at, astounded by, the depth of thought that must have gone into Lincoln's great addresses. As a young man and a lawyer, this perpetuation address, Lyceum address, in 1838, which features civic education as the remedy for the growing mob violence and political violence erupting in the 1830s in America. Not to mention, great addresses from the 1850s by Lincoln in the period before the Civil War. And then his first inaugural, annual messages, Gettysburg Address, second inaugural, right? If we think there must have been extraordinary thought behind such carefully crafted and profound statements, I'd at least ask the question as an educator, shouldn't we look at Washington's writings as a busy executive from 1783 onward? And like Lincoln, a man who did not have a college education, but invested in his self-education. I mentioned earlier, at his death, there are 900 books in the Mount Vernon Library. And books were very expensive and rare in that time. And they're not all about agriculture and plantation life and military affairs, right? They're books of philosophy and politics and law in the collection. So here's a self-educated man, and you read the addresses we know were largely drafted by himself, like the 1783 circular, but his careful use of these advisors and his working through drafts of major addresses, and think there must be significant thought here. And then to note the important differences that he has with some of these very bright advisors, just on the point of party and politics and faction. He seems to be wiser than any one of them at the moment in the 1790s, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, to think in a deeper constitutional way about what was needed at the moment, but also the enduring lesson. So I think it's a good test for students and for scholars and professors to work through, to read some of these addresses and think about how extraordinary it is that this busy man, this busy, dominating executive figure could, with smart advisors for several of these addresses, craft such important testaments to and offer such important enduring lessons for our whole constitutional order.
Well, Paul Carrese, thank you for rejoining us, and thank you for your efforts on behalf of civic education and your scholarship. And we're delighted to have you back. Perhaps we'll have you here again in the future. But thank you very much for leading us on this tour of Washington's farewell address.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the wonderful, important work the James Madison Foundation undertakes.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.